The air over the high desert shimmered with heat, baking the cracked earth until the distant mesas swam like ghosts on the horizon. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything in a gritty film of pale red. It was a land of harsh truths and little mercy, a place where a man's past could lie buried for years until the wind decided to shift. For Elias Vance, the wind had just shifted. The stagecoach, a splash of garish red and yellow against the muted landscape, lay on its side like a slaughtered beast. The horses screamed, their legs tangled in the leather traces. 3 men, their faces masked by bandanas, were dragging strongboxes from the wreckage, while a 4th held a rifle on the terrified passengers huddled by the roadside. Elias had seen it from the ridge where he'd been tracking a stray calf. He wasn't a lawman anymore. The silver star he once wore was a ghost against his chest, a weight he'd shed years ago, along with the man he used to be. He told himself to turn his horse to ride back to the quiet solitude of his ranch, but his body was already moving instinct, overriding conscious thought. He urged his mare Bess down the rocky incline, his movements fluid and silent, a predator returning to a hunt he'd long since abandoned. He circled around, using the cover of a shallow arroyo to approach from the south. The crack of a rifle echoed, followed by a woman's cry. They were getting impatient. Elias dismounted, pulling the worn Winchester from its scabbard. The stock was smooth against his cheek, a familiar and unwelcome comfort. Dust kicked up. A shot rang out. Elias dove for cover. He moved from rock to rock, a shadow in the blistering sun. One of the robbers was trying to break open a strongbox with the butt of his rifle. Elias took aim. The shot was perfect, a clean strike that sent the man's rifle spinning from his hands. The bandit cried out, clutching a shattered wrist. Chaos erupted. The other 2 robbers whirled around, firing wildly into the rocks. The passengers screamed and scrambled for safety. Elias shifted his position, firing again, this time kicking up a shower of dirt at the feet of the man, guarding the passengers, forcing him back. "Get out of here." Elias's voice was a low growl, rusty from disuse. "Take your man and ride." The leader, a big man with a sweat-stained hat, hesitated, his eyes scanning the rocks for a target. "There's only one of him," he yelled to his remaining partner. It was a fatal miscalculation. As the 3rd man raised his pistol, Elias was already moving. He burst from cover, closing the distance with the speed of a striking snake. He didn't fire. He slammed the barrel of his Winchester into the man's jaw, a sharp crack of bone that dropped him into the dust. Before the leader could react, Elias had his own revolver, leveled the hammer, cocked with a final definitive click. The fight was over. The leader stared down the barrel of the Colt, his bravado evaporating in the oppressive heat. He dropped his gun. Elias kept his weapon steady, his gaze hard. "Get on your horses. Leave everything." The leader dragged his 2 wounded accomplices onto their mounts and galloped away, a trail of dust and curses in their wake. Elias didn't watch them go. His attention was on the man he'd struck down. The man was stirring, moaning, his bandana having slipped from his face. As he tried to push himself up, something small and silver fell from his coat pocket, glinting in the harsh sunlight. A locket. Elias knelt, his pistol still trained on the man, and picked it up. It was simple, etched with the design of a single wildflower. His thumb found the clasp and pressed. It sprang open. Inside there was no portrait, only a faded, empty space where one should have been. But it wasn't the emptiness that made his breath catch. It was the locket itself. He knew it. The sight of it was a key turning a lock in the darkest corner of his mind. A memory, fragmented and searing, flashed behind his eyes. Burning timbers, crashing down the roar of the fire, a living thing. The smell of pine and smoke and something else. Something terrible. A woman's scream cut short, a child's cry thin and desperate. His own voice hoarse from shouting orders, calling out in the chaos of a ranger raid gone wrong. He felt a cold dread wash over him, so profound it was like being plunged into ice water. He'd carried that night with him for 5 years, a nightmare of faceless victims and his own failure. He had never known their names, only that they were a family caught in the crossfire of his pursuit of a vicious gang. He had never seen the locket up close, only glimpsed it on the ground as the homestead burned. He looked from the locket to the dazed man on the ground. This wasn't a random stagecoach robbery. This was a message. The past he had run so far to escape had finally found him. The quiet life he had tried to build was about to be burned to the ground. The town of redemption was dying of thirst. Not just for water, but for hope. It sat nestled in a canyon, carved by a river that was now little more than a muddy trickle, its lifeblood choked off somewhere upstream. The unforgiving sun baked the cracked earth until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, and the single dusty street felt like the floor of a kiln. Elias Vance's ranch was a few miles outside of town, a small defensible patch of land with a deep well and just enough grass to sustain a handful of cattle. He had chosen it for its isolation, a place where the ghosts of his past had a harder time finding him. He worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythm of his chores a bulwark against the memories that clawed at him in the quiet of the night. He mended fences with meticulous precision, his hands calloused and sure. He tended his livestock with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only by his reputation. But he never slept through the night. He would wake in a cold sweat, the scent of smoke in his nostrils, the sound of a child's cry echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. The townsfolk of Redemption viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They knew he was a former Texas Ranger, the way he carried himself, the economy of his movements, the cold stillness in his eyes, all spoke of a man who had seen too much violence. But he kept to himself, his conversations limited to curt nods or one-word answers when he came to town for supplies. He was a closed book, and in the West, a closed book was often a dangerous one. Sheriff Brody was the only man in town who ever tried to pry it open. He was a practical, weary lawman whose face was a roadmap of sun wrinkles and worry. He found Elias in the general store stocking up on coffee and cartridges. "Heard you had some trouble out on the stage road." Elias Brody said, his voice low. He leaned against a barrel of pickles, a stark contrast to Elias's coiled tension. "Trouble found me," Elias replied without looking up, his voice a low rasp. "I sent it on its way." "They left the strong boxes," Brody pressed. "That ain't typical. Robbers don't usually work that hard just to ride off empty-handed." Elias stopped, his hand hovering over a sack of flour. He knew what Brody was getting at. It wasn't a robbery. It was a test. A probe. Maybe they weren't typical robbers. Maybe not, Brody agreed, his gaze steady. Maybe they're connected to Silas Kane. The name hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. Kane was the shadow stretching over Redemption. A wealthy, enigmatic man who had arrived 6 months prior, buying up failing ranches for prices that were too good to refuse, but too low to start over elsewhere. He was a vulture circling a dying town, and everyone knew it. His manor, built on a high plateau overlooking the valley, was a fortress of new lumber and cold stone, a monument to power in a land of poverty. "Kane doesn't need to rob stagecoaches," Elias said, finally turning to face the sheriff. "He's choking this town to death without firing a shot." "He is now," Brody said, his weariness deepening. "His men have been getting bolder, more disciplined. Last week, old man Henderson's place caught fire. He didn't make it out." Elias's jaw tightened. Henderson had been a stubborn old rancher, one of the last holdouts who had refused to sell to Kane. "I know what you're thinking." Elias Brody continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But I don't have proof. I'm just one man and my deputy. Well, Miller's a good lad, but he's green. This is getting bigger than I can handle. I could use a man with your experience." The request was a spark on dry tinder. Elias felt a familiar sickening lurch in his gut. The locket felt heavy in his pocket, a cold reminder of where that experience had led him. "You're asking the wrong man, Sheriff. I'm not him anymore. That ranger is dead." He paid for his supplies, his movements clipped and final, and walked out of the store, leaving Brody standing amidst the scent of pickles and despair. He didn't want to get involved. He just wanted to be left alone. But as he mounted Bess and looked down the parched street at the tired faces of the people of redemption, he knew it was already too late. Silas Kane had brought the war to his doorstep, and the silver locket in his pocket was proof that this was a war he had started long ago. The night was moonless and still the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Elias was in his small cabin, cleaning his Winchester by the light of a single oil lamp, when a flicker of orange against the dark horizon caught his eye. It was to the east, in the direction of the Henderson Ranch, the one Sheriff Brody had mentioned. But this was a new fire, a hungry bloom of light growing against the black silhouette of the hills. He was on his horse in minutes, the rifle back in its scabbard, his face a grim mask. He rode hard, the rhythmic beat of Bess's hooves a drumbeat of dread in his ears. As he drew closer, the smell of wood smoke and burning grass filled the air. He wasn't heading toward the Henderson place, but the one next to it, the O'Malley Ranch. He'd spoken to Liam O'Malley only a handful of times, a hard-working man with a kind wife and a young daughter named Sarah. They were one of the few families who had treated Elias with simple, open friendliness, waving to him on the road, offering a smile that asked for nothing in return. They too had refused to sell to Kane. He found the barn already consumed, a roaring inferno, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The small cabin was next, flames licking at the dry timber of the porch. Liam O'Malley was trying to beat back the fire with a wet blanket, his face streaked with soot and panic, while his wife Mary carried buckets of water from their nearly dry well. Their daughter Sarah stood near the house, her small face illuminated by the destructive light, her eyes wide with terror. Elias dismounted, his mind racing. This wasn't a random act. It was an execution. He grabbed the blanket from Liam's hands. "Get your family clear now. I can't lose it." "Vance." Liam yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's everything we have. You'll lose your life." Elias shoved him toward his wife. "Go." As the O'Malleys scrambled to safety, Elias saw them, two riders on the edge of the firelight, watching the blaze with a chilling satisfaction. They weren't trying to hide. They were sending a message. He raised his Winchester, the firelight glinting off the long barrel. He didn't aim to kill. He fired a single shot into the dirt at their horses' feet. The animals shrieked and reared, and the riders, caught off guard, fought to control them before spurring them into the darkness. The house was lost. Elias knew it. He helped the O'Malleys pull a few precious belongings from the cabin before the roof collapsed in a shower of embers. They stood together in the dying light of the fire, watching their life's work turn to ash. Mary wept quietly, holding her daughter close, while Liam stared into the flames, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The next morning, Sheriff Brody rode out to the smoldering ruins, his deputy Miller in tow. Miller was young, with an eager face that seemed out of place amidst the devastation. He poked at the charred timbers with a boot, looking more curious than concerned. Brody's eyes, however, were fixed on Elias. "This has Kane's stink all over it," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "They killed a man last week," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "Now this. He's not trying to buy the valley anymore, Brody. He's trying to break it. I need more than a feeling to go after a man like Kane," Brody said, gesturing helplessly at the wreckage. "I need proof. A witness." "You have one," Elias stated. "I saw two of his men watching the fire." Deputy Miller spoke up, his tone dismissive. "In the dark, Elias, from a distance. Could you identify them in a lineup?" Elias's gaze flickered to Miller, a flicker of cold assessment. The deputy's question was logical, but his tone was wrong. It wasn't the skepticism of a lawman. It was the challenge of a doubter. "I know what I saw," Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. He turned to Elias, his expression pleading. "I'm out of my depth. The town council won't fund more deputies, and the circuit judge won't be back for months. Kane owns the bank, the freight office. He's strangling us. You were a ranger. You know how to handle men like this. Help me." It was the same request as before, but this time it landed differently. Last night, watching the O'Malley family lose everything, seeing the terror in young Sarah's eyes, Elias had felt something other than the cold dread of his past. He had felt a hot, righteous anger. He had seen his own failure reflected in the flames, the failure to protect the innocent, the failure that had driven him into exile. He looked at the smoking ruins of the O'Malley home, and then at the sheriff's desperate face. He could still say no. He could still ride back to his ranch and bolt the door. But the fire had burned away his resolve to hide. Kane had made it personal, not just by digging up his past, but by threatening the fragile peace of the few decent people left in this valley. He thought of the silver locket. He thought of the family he couldn't save. He looked at the family he had just helped save, and a decision settled in his soul, heavy and irrevocable. "I won't wear a star," Brody Elias said, his voice low but firm, "but I'll help." He paused, his eyes like chips of flint. "This stops now." The refusal was a promise. The man he had buried was not gone after all. He was just waiting for a reason to dig his way out. The river was the life of the valley. Now it was a death rattle. Within a week of the O'Malley fire, the already weak flow of water into Redemption dwindled to nothing. The town's cisterns were dangerously low, cattle their ribs showing bald with thirst in dusty pens. The once green patches of garden behind the small houses withered and turned brown. A tense, desperate silence fell over the town, broken only by the creak of the dry water pump. Elias knew it wasn't the drought. It was Kane. He rode upstream, following the riverbed's cracked and baking path. 5 miles north of town, in a narrow part of the canyon on land Kane now owned, he found it. A new dam, crudely but effectively built from rock and timber, blocked the river entirely. A small reservoir was forming behind it, a glittering pool of stolen life, while downstream the land starved. A half-dozen of Kane's men were camped nearby, rifles leaning against the rocks, their presence a clear and brutal warning. He watched from a high ridge until dusk, studying the layout of the camp, the patrol patterns, the dam's structure. His mind, once clouded by guilt and solitude, sharpened to a razor's edge. The old instincts, the ranger's tactical thinking, returned, as if they had never left. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a hunter, and he had found his prey's weakness. He returned to his ranch and gathered what he needed: a length of rope, a pry bar, and 3 sticks of dynamite left over from his time clearing rocks for his foundation. He had hoped he would never have a use for them again. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, he made his way back to the dam, moving on foot through the scrub and shadows. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. The guards were complacent, huddled around a small fire, their laughter echoing faintly in the canyon. Elias moved like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the rocky ground. He slipped past their perimeter, his heart a slow, steady drum in his chest. This was familiar territory, a dark dance he knew all too well. He reached the dam, a dark wall of rock and wood against the star-dusted sky. He found what he was looking for, a key support beam wedged into the canyon wall, the linchpin of the entire structure. He worked quickly and silently, drilling a small hole, packing the dynamite, and setting a short fuse. He didn't want to obliterate the dam, just break its back. A loud explosion would bring Kane's men running before he could get clear. He needed a subtler kind of destruction. He used the pry bar, wedging it between 2 of the main logs. He put his weight into it, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining. Wood groaned in protest. He worked methodically, weakening the structure joint by joint. Finally, with a great splintering crack, a section of the dam gave way. A trickle of water became a torrent pouring through the new gap. It was enough. The pressure of the reservoir would do the rest. He lit the fuse not for a massive blast, but for a sharp concussive crack that would shatter the already weakened support beam. He scrambled back up the canyon wall as the fuse hissed. A moment later, a dull thump echoed through the canyon, followed by the sound of splintering timber and a great roaring rush of water. From his vantage point, he watched as Kane's men shouted in alarm, grabbing their rifles and running toward the breached dam. But it was too late. The river, freed from its prison, was surging downstream, a muddy, churning wave of life returning to the valley. Elias didn't wait to watch their confusion turn to anger. He slipped back into the night, the mission accomplished. By morning, water was flowing through Redemption again. A cheer went up from the townsfolk as the pump handle brought forth a gush of water instead of a wheezing gasp of air. They saw it as a miracle, a blessing from a merciful God. Elias and Sheriff Brody knew better. "You just painted a target on your back the size of Texas," Brody said, finding Elias by his well watching the water level rise. The target was already there. Elias replied, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon toward Kane's fortress. He just didn't know who to aim at. Now he does. The sabotage of the dam had been a declaration of war. He had restored the water, but he had also marked himself as Silas Kane's primary and most dangerous enemy. The quiet life was officially over. The fight for redemption had just begun. Kane's retaliation was swift and personal. It didn't come in the form of fire or overt violence, but with a cold, calculated precision that was far more unnerving. 2 days after the dam was breached, Elias found half his well fence cut and 3 of his best cattle missing. A week later, the feed supplier in town suddenly ran out of the grain he needed, despite a fully stocked storeroom. Small acts of sabotage designed to bleed him dry to isolate him further. Elias knew this was more than simple harassment. It was a strategy. Kane was testing his defenses, probing his weaknesses, and most importantly, studying his reactions. The discipline of Kane's men, the careful planning, it all felt unnervingly familiar. It reminded him of the tactics employed by the very gangs he used to hunt. He began his own quiet investigation. He spent his days ostensibly working his ranch, but his eyes were always scanning the horizon. He spent his nights poring over old maps of the county, tracing property lines, water rights, and abandoned mining claims. He was looking for a pattern, a logic to Kane's acquisitions beyond simple greed. His search led him to Jedediah, an old prospector who lived in a ramshackle hut deep in the hills, his only companions, a stubborn mule, and a lifetime of memories etched into his weathered face. Jedediah had seen the valley change more than any man alive. "Silas Kane," the old man rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "He ain't like the others. The railroad men, the cattle barons, they were hungry for land for profit. This one, he's hungry for something else." "What do you mean?" Elias asked, sharing his coffee by the prospector's small fire. "He paid me a visit when he first arrived," Jedediah continued, his eyes distant. "Didn't want my claim. Wanted my knowledge. Asked me all sorts of questions about the old trails, the abandoned mines, who lived where 20 years ago. Paid special attention when I mentioned the old Miller farm." The name struck Elias like a physical blow. The Miller farm. The name from Kane's revelation that was yet to come, unknowingly planted like a seed. "What about it?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Nothing but cursed ground now," Jedediah said, shaking his head. "Family was wiped out in a ranger raid years back. A real tragedy." Kane seemed interested. Asked where they were buried. Strange fella. The conversation left Elias with a deep sense of unease. Kane's interest in the valley felt less like business and more like an obsession. He wasn't just buying land. He was reclaiming a memory. Meanwhile, The pressure on the town was mounting. Kane's men rode through the streets with an arrogant swagger, intimidating anyone who showed a hint of defiance. Sheriff Brody was doing his best, but he and Deputy Miller were spread thin. Elias noticed Miller was often the first to dismiss any new evidence against Kane. When a rancher reported seeing Kane's men diverting a stream, Miller wrote it off as a property line dispute. When another claimed he was threatened, Miller suggested it was a drunken misunderstanding. He was either incompetent or complicit. Elias suspected the latter, realizing he couldn't win a war of attrition alone. Elias made a decision that went against every instinct he had. He called a meeting with a handful of ranchers who hadn't yet sold out to Kane, including Liam O'Malley, who was now living with his family in a spare room at the boarding house. They gathered in the livery stable after dark, their faces grim in the lantern light. "Kane isn't going to stop," Elias told them, his voice low and direct. "He'll pick us off one by one until he has the whole valley. Brody can't protect us. We have to protect ourselves." There were murmurs of fear and doubt. They were ranchers, not fighters. "I'm not asking you to be soldiers," Elias said, his gaze sweeping over them. "I'm asking you to be ready, to stand together. I'll show you how to shoot, how to fortify your homes, how to watch each other's backs." He spent the next few weeks turning farmers into a militia. He was a hard teacher, patient, but demanding. He corrected their stances, taught them to reload under pressure, to think defensively. He saw the fire of determination grow in their eyes, replacing the fear. In teaching them, he felt a flicker of his old self return. Not the haunted man hiding from his past, but the leader who had once inspired loyalty and courage. He was starting to build something, a small community of resistance. And for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't entirely alone. But Kane was always one step ahead. A planned night patrol was ambushed. A hidden stash of supplies was discovered and destroyed. It was as if Kane knew their every move. The traitor in their midst was feeding him information, and Elias had a cold certainty who it was. The final confrontation was coming, and Elias knew he had to force it, to draw Kane out from behind his wall of money and hired guns and face him directly. He decided to ride to Kane's manor, believing he could negotiate some kind of truce. He was wrong. He wasn't riding toward a negotiation. He was riding toward the truth. The road to Silas Kane's manor climbed out of the parched valley and into the cooler air of the high plateau. The house was an imposing structure of dark timber and gray stone, a fortress designed to look down on the world. As Elias rode up the long drive, he saw men stationed on the rooftop, their rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun. This was not a home. It was a command post. He was met at the door by 2 guards who disarmed him before leading him into a large study. The room was the antithesis of redemption's dusty poverty. It was filled with mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and maps of the valley covering an entire wall. Silas Kane stood by a large window, his back to the door, staring out at the land he was systematically conquering. When he turned, he was not what Elias expected. Kane was not a burly, rugged cattle baron. He was a man of medium height, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his face pale and intelligent, his eyes a chilling, piercing blue. He moved with a quiet grace that was more menacing than any brute force. Elias Vance Kane said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. The ghost of the Texas Rangers. "I've been expecting you." He gestured to a leather armchair. "Please." Elias remained standing. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Kane. Your war on this valley is over." A faint, cold smile touched Kane's lips. He walked to a small table and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, holding one out to Elias. Elias ignored it. "War," Kane said, taking a slow sip. "This isn't a war, Mr. Vance. It's an exorcism. I am simply cleansing this land of a lingering sickness." He set his glass down. "You believe this is about water, about cattle, about worthless, sun-scorched dirt? You see me as just another greedy man. I see what your men have done. Elias, said his voice hard. I see the families you've ruined. Ruin is a matter of perspective. Cain replied, his voice dropping, becoming intensely personal. Tell me, Mr. Vance, in all your years as a ranger, chasing down outlaws, dispensing your brand of frontier justice, do you ever think of the people caught in the middle? The ones who had no part in your battles but paid the highest price? The question landed like a punch, stirring the embers of Elias's ever-present guilt. He thought of the burning homestead of the faceless family. Your men are disciplined, Elias said, deflecting. They use tactics I recognize. Who are they? They are loyal men, Cain said simply. Men who understand the importance of a debt being paid in full. He walked over to his desk and picked up a small framed photograph. He held it out. I believe you are familiar with the subjects. Elias's blood ran cold. The photograph was old and faded, but the image was clear, a smiling man with a proud wife and two small children, a boy and a girl. And on the girl's neck, catching the light, was a simple silver locket. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, to the identical locket he had carried since the stagecoach robbery. His mind reeled, the fragmented memories crashing together into one horrific, complete picture. They called it the Miller Farm. Cain said, his voice no longer smooth, but laced with a cold, bottomless fury. A quaint, simple name for a place you and your rangers burned to the ground. You were hunting the Dixon gang, as I recall? You cornered them there. You said they fired first. Elias couldn't speak. His throat was tight with a truth he could no longer deny. The man in the photograph, the smiling father, was a younger Silas Cain. The family name was Miller. My name was Silas Miller, and then Cain confirmed, his blue eyes burning with a grief that had curdled into pure hatred. I was in town for supplies when you arrived. I saw the smoke from miles away. By the time I returned, my wife Elizabeth, my son Thomas, my daughter Anna, they were gone. You burned them alive with the animals you were hunting. The fight wasn't about land. It was never about land. The ranches Cain had bought, the water he dammed it, was all worthless to him, except for one reason. This land you're fighting to protect, Cain's voice was a venomous whisper. It is their grave. You turned my home into a cemetery, Vance, and I have returned to collect the debt. Elias was shattered. The nightmare that had haunted his every waking moment for 5 years suddenly had a name. The faceless victims had faces, and the man whose life he had destroyed was standing right in front of him, armed not just with guns and money, but with a righteous vengeance that Elias himself had created. The ghost he had been running from had finally caught him, and it wore the face of Silas Cain. The revelation broke something in Elias. He rode back from Cain's manor in a daze, the world muted and gray. His guilt was no longer a shapeless specter. It was a living, breathing entity, and its name was Silas Cain. He understood now. Cain wasn't a villain in his own story. He was a man seeking justice for an unforgivable crime, and Elias was the perpetrator. Cain, now driven purely by vengeance, abandoned all pretense of business. His campaign of terror escalated, becoming more cruel, more personal. He was no longer trying to drive people out. He was trying to break Elias's spirit. He wanted Elias to watch the town he had chosen to protect die just as Cain had been forced to watch his family die. The final act began a few days later. Elias had been helping the O'Malley family reinforce the small cabin they were rebuilding with the help of their neighbors. He had developed a quiet fondness for them, especially for young Sarah, whose bright, innocent eyes were a stark contrast to the darkness that filled his own. Her laughter was a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed. He was showing her how to carve a small bird from a piece of scrap wood when Deputy Miller rode up, his face flushed with apparent urgency. "Elias, Sheriff Brody needs you down at the south pasture," Miller said, breathless. "Some of Kane's men are cutting fences again. He said to come quick." Elias felt a prickle of suspicion. It seemed too simple, too convenient. But Brody was his friend. He looked at Sarah, who was holding the half-finished bird. "I'll be back to finish this later," he promised her, ruffling her hair. He saddled Bess and rode south. The pasture was empty. There were no cut fences, no sign of Kane's men, and no Sheriff Brody. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. He had been tricked. He spurred Bess into a gallop, racing back toward the O'Malley place, his heart pounding with a terrible premonition. He was too late. Liam and Mary O'Malley were tied up inside their half-built cabin, their faces bruised. Sarah was gone. On the table, pinned by a knife, was a note. The handwriting was elegant, precise. "A life for a life, Mr. Vance. You took my daughter from me. Now I have taken one from you. If you wish to see her again, come to the old North Star silver mine. Come alone. The ghosts of the past are waiting for you." Pinned beneath the note was the small wooden bird he had been carving, snapped in two. Elias's grief and guilt erupted into a cold, focused rage. Miller's betrayal was now absolute. The deputy had not just been an informant. He had actively helped facilitate the kidnapping of a child. He had used Elias's trust and the sheriff's authority to set the trap. Elias freed the O'Malleys, his face a mask of stone. "Stay here. Barricade the door," he commanded. He checked his Colt, loaded his Winchester, and gathered the last of his dynamite. He was no longer a rancher or a haunted recluse. He was the ranger again, the hunter, but this time the hunt was not for justice. It was for redemption. As he rode toward the mountains where the abandoned mine scarred the earth that if the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, whipping sand and dust into the air. A storm was coming. The world was about to be plunged into the same kind of swirling, violent chaos that raged inside his own soul. The North Star silver mine was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, its entrance timbers rotting like ancient ribs. The sandstorm hit just as Elias arrived, a furious, suffocating wall of brown that reduced visibility to a few feet and filled the air with a deafening roar. The wind howled like a banshee, and the groan of the decaying mine supports was a constant, ominous chorus. It was the perfect setting for a final showdown, a treacherous, collapsing hell on earth. Elias dismounted, leaving Bess in a sheltered ravine. He moved toward the mine entrance, a ghost in the swirling dust. He knew Kane would have men watching, but the storm was his ally, masking his approach. A rifle shot cracked from the rocks above the bullet, whining past his ear. He dove behind a rusted ore cart, the Winchester already in his hand. He didn't fire back. He listened, using the storm's roar to pinpoint the shooter's position. He saw a flicker of movement, a silhouette against the brown haze. He fired once. A cry echoed, and the silhouette vanished. One down, he slipped inside the mine, the darkness enveloping him. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. The howl of the wind was muffled now, replaced by the drip of water and the unsettling creak of the support beams. He was in their world now, a labyrinth of collapsing tunnels and treacherous pits. He moved with a ranger's practiced silence, his senses on high alert. He heard voices ahead, distorted by the echoes of the tunnel. He flattened himself against the rock wall as two of Kane's men walked past their lanterns, casting dancing, distorted shadows. "He won't make it past the entrance," one of them muttered. Elias let them pass and then followed. He took them out from behind, swift and silent, using the butt of his rifle. He left them bound and gagged in a side tunnel. He was not here to kill them. They were just pawns. His targets were Kane and the traitor Miller. He pushed deeper, following the tracks of a small ore cart. He found Sarah in a side chamber, tied to a support beam. Deputy Miller stood guard over her, his face pale with fear, his pistol trembling in his hand. "It's over. Miller Elias said, his voice emerging from the darkness. Miller yelped, spinning around and firing blindly. The shot ricocheted off the rock wall. Sarah screamed. "Don't be a fool," Elias said, stepping into the edge of the lantern light, his Winchester leveled. "You're in over your head. Cain is just using you. He promised me a share." Miller stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "He said no one would get hurt." "Look at the girl, Miller." Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "Does she look unhurt to you? Let her go. It's the last good choice you'll ever make." For a moment, Miller hesitated. Then, with a sob of surrender, he dropped the gun. Elias moved in quickly, cutting Sarah free and pushing her behind him. "Get to the entrance," he told her. "Don't stop running." She fled into the darkness as he tied up the disgraced deputy. A slow, deliberate applause echoed from deeper within the mine. Silas Cain emerged from the shadows, holding a lantern high. His suit was unblemished by the mine's filth, his expression one of cold amusement. "Bravo," Vance Cain said. "The legendary ranger living up to his reputation. But you're too late to save everyone." A low groan rumbled through the mine. Dust trickled from the ceiling. The storm outside was putting immense pressure on the mountain. The entire structure was becoming unstable. "This mine is as rotten as your soul," Vance Cain said, pulling a dueling pistol from his coat. "It is a fitting place for you to be buried. A tomb for you and the ghosts you carry." He fired. Elias dove aside as the shot splintered the rock where he'd been standing. The fight was on. It was a brutal, desperate battle amidst falling debris and swirling dust. They exchanged fire, the gunshots deafening in the enclosed space. Elias used his wits, extinguishing Cain's lantern with a well-aimed shot, plunging them into near-total darkness, broken only by the flashes of their guns. He stalked Cain through the collapsing tunnels, the hunter and the avenger, in a deadly game. The ground shook violently, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, separating them. Elias knew he had one chance. He took out his last stick of dynamite, lit the fuse, and threw it toward the main support beam of the cavern where Cain was trapped. The explosion was immense, bringing a huge section of the mine roof down. Elias was thrown back by the blast. When the dust settled, he saw Cain pinned beneath a heavy timber. His leg crushed the dueling pistol just out of his reach. Elias approached, his Colt steady in his hand. Cain looked up at him, his face a mask of pain and undiluted hatred. "Do it," he rasped. "Finish it. Avenge my family by killing their murderer. Become the monster I know you are." Elias stood over him, the gun aimed at Cain's head. The ghosts of the past screamed at him to pull the trigger. Revenge was his for the taking. Justice for the Miller family. An end to his own torment. But as he looked into Cain's eyes, he saw not a monster, but a man broken by grief, a mirror of his own haunted soul. Killing him would not be justice. It would be a surrender to the very darkness he had been fighting both in the world and within himself. He slowly lowered the pistol. "No," Elias said, his voice clear and steady above the groan of the dying mine. "Your debt isn't to me, it's to the law." He holstered his weapon, refusing to become the man Cain believed him to be. He grabbed a fallen timber and with a grunt of exertion began to lever the beam off Cain's crushed leg, choosing the heavy burden of justice over the easy release of revenge. The sandstorm had passed by the time Elias emerged from the mine, dragging a captive Cain and a weeping Miller behind him. The sky was washed clean, a brilliant bruised purple in the pre-dawn light. Sarah O'Malley was waiting at the mine entrance with Sheriff Brody and a small posse of ranchers Elias had trained. The girl ran into Elias's arms, sobbing with relief. Back in Redemption, the town was slowly waking up to a world that felt new and fragile. The sight of Elias Vance riding down the main street with Silas Cain and Deputy Miller in tow was a spectacle that stopped everyone in their tracks. The shadow of fear that had hung over the town for months finally lifted. Kane and Miller were locked in the town jail, the steel bars, a final definitive end to their reign of terror. The townsfolk who had once viewed Elias with suspicion now hailed him as a hero. They clapped him on the back, offered him drinks at the saloon, and thanked him with voices thick with emotion. Elias accepted their gratitude with a quiet, awkward nod. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had finally stopped running from the ghosts of his past. Later that day, he sat with Sheriff Brody in his office, the scent of stale coffee hanging in the air. "The circuit judge will have a field day with this," Brody said, looking at the two prisoners in their cells. He turned to Elias, his expression serious. Kane confessed to everything, including the Miller farm. Elias stared out the window at the town he had fought for. "It was my raid, Brody. My mistake. I was young, arrogant. I thought the only thing that mattered was catching the bad men. I never stopped to think about who else was in the line of fire." Brody was silent for a moment. "The man you were then isn't the man you are today, Elias. Today you saved a child. You saved this town. You brought two men to justice instead of putting them in the ground. That has to count for something." It did. It didn't erase the past, but it offered the possibility of a future. Before leaving town, he stopped by the O'Malley's place. The community was already helping them rebuild, the sound of hammers ringing with a new, hopeful energy. Sarah ran out to meet him. She shyly held out her hand. In it was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. She had finished the one he had started for her. He took the small token, his calloused fingers gentle as he closed them around the wood. It felt heavier than any gun, more valuable than any reward. It was a symbol of his newfound purpose, a connection to a life he had never thought he could have. He had come to redemption to hide, but he had found something else entirely. Weeks later, redemption was beginning to thrive. The water flowed freely, and with Kane's stranglehold broken commerce, and hope returned to the parched valley. Elias Vance was no longer a recluse. He was a part of the town, his quiet presence a source of comfort and strength. He worked alongside his neighbors, the shared labor of rebuilding a town, a better balm for his soul than solitude had ever been. One clear, cool morning, he rode out from town, not toward his ranch, but toward the cursed ground Jedediah had told him about, the land that had once been the Miller farm. There was nothing left but a blackened patch of earth and the stone foundation of a burned-out house. Nearby, under the shade of a lone, resilient cottonwood tree, were 3 mounds of earth. During his first days in the valley, before he knew its history, he had found them and assumed they were old, forgotten graves. Now he knew their names. He had spent a day carving simple wooden markers. Elizabeth Thomas Anna. He dismounted and walked to the smallest grave, the one belonging to the little girl. From his pocket he took the silver locket. He polished it on his sleeve, the metal warm from his touch, and gently placed it on the wooden marker. It glinted in the morning sun, a final silent apology. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, and said a silent prayer, not of forgiveness for himself, but of peace for them. A weight lifted from his shoulders, a burden he had carried for 5 long years. He had not erased his past, but he had finally faced it. He had honored the dead not by joining them in darkness, but by protecting the living. He turned, leaving the locket behind, and swung himself up onto Bess's saddle. For a moment he looked west toward the setting sun and the open range, the traditional path of the lonely rider. But his journey in that direction was over. He turned his horse and rode back toward the welcoming lights of redemption, a man who had finally, against all odds, come home.